Long before the word Tartary vanished from maps, cartographers drew it across a third of the world's surface. From the Caspian Sea to the Pacific Ocean, from Siberia to the borders of China, the name appeared on every major atlas for 3 centuries. Mercator marked it in 1594. Blaeu detailed its subdivisions in 1635. D'Anville mapped its rivers and mountain ranges in 1737. Wilde still labelled vast territories as Tartarian in 1820. Then, within a generation, it disappeared. Not gradually, but suddenly, as though an entire empire had been erased from memory. The geographic scope was extraordinary. What European cartographers called Tartary encompassed modern Russia, east of the Urals, Mongolia, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, and portions of northern China. On many maps, it was subdivided into distinct regions. Great Tartary stretched across Siberia. Independent Tartary occupied the lands between the Caspian and the Tian Shan Mountains. Chinese Tartary lay along the western territories of the Qing dynasty. Muscovite Tartary marked the contested borderlands between Russian expansion and the steppes beyond. Together, these territories covered approximately 15 million square kilometers, an area larger than the entire Roman Empire at its height. Yet by 1900, the name had vanished. The 9th edition of Encyclopaedia Britannica, published between 1875 and 1889, still contained a substantial entry for Tartary, describing its geography, peoples, and history. The 11th edition, published in 1911, relegated the term to a brief historical note. Modern atlases do not mark it at all. The land remains, of course. The Siberian plains, the Central Asian deserts, the Mongolian steppes have not moved. But the name that unified them for centuries disappeared from cartographic practice as completely as though it had never existed. The question this raises is not merely semantic. Geographic labels reflect how societies understand space. When cartographers across Europe independently chose to mark vast territories as Tartary for 300 years, they were documenting a shared recognition. Something existed there significant enough to name, organized enough to subdivide, and real enough to mark on every serious map of the world. The consistency across nations and centuries suggests that Tartary represented more than vague references to nomadic peoples. It pointed to a geographic and perhaps cultural entity that European scholars, despite limited direct contact, acknowledged as distinct. The etymology of the name itself hints at this complexity. Tartary derives from Tatar, the designation given to various Turkic and Mongol peoples who dominated the Central Asian steppes after the 13th century. Yet the geographic extent of Tartary on historical maps far exceeds the territories controlled by any single Tatar group. Marco Polo, writing in the late 13th century, used the term to describe not only the Mongol domains, but regions beyond them, territories he had travelled through or heard described by others. His account, composed from memory in a Genoese prison in 1298, treated Tartary as a vast landscape of kingdoms, cities, and peoples stretching from the Black Sea to the edges of the known world. Other medieval travellers left similar testimony. William of Rubruck, a Franciscan friar dispatched by King Louis IX of France, journeyed into Mongol territories in 1253. His chronicle described not scattered nomad camps, but organized centers of power, sophisticated postal systems, and administrative networks spanning thousands of kilometers. Ibn Battuta, the Moroccan explorer whose travels in the 14th century took him across 3 continents, documented his passage through Central Asian cities, he identified as Tartarian. Samarkand, Bukhara, and other urban centers appeared in his accounts as places of learning, trade, and architectural splendor. These were not fantasies. Archaeological evidence confirms that such cities existed and flourished during the periods these travelers described. So what changed? How does a geographic designation used consistently for centuries disappear within decades? The standard explanation focuses on political transformation. As the Russian Empire expanded eastward through the 18th and 19th centuries, territories once labeled Tartary were absorbed into new administrative units. Siberia became a Russian possession. Central Asia was divided among colonial powers during the Great Game, the strategic competition between Russia and Britain. China reasserted control over Western territories. New names replaced old. Tartary, no longer serving a political or administrative function, faded from use. Yet this explanation, though partially accurate, does not fully account for the completeness of the erasure. Other obsolete geographic terms remain in historical consciousness. Persia became Iran, but scholars still reference Persian territories. Byzantium became the Ottoman Empire, yet Byzantine history remains a recognized field. Numidia and Illyria disappeared as political entities, but survive in historical discourse. Tartary, by contrast, vanished so thoroughly that by the mid-20th century, few outside specialized academic circles recognized the term at all. Maps that once displayed it prominently now reside in archives, consulted rarely, their geographic vocabulary treated as archaic rather than informative. The persistence of the name across centuries of map-making suggests more than cartographic tradition. Different cartographers working in different countries with access to different sources repeatedly marked the same vast region with the same designation. Mercator in Flanders, Bleu in Amsterdam, D'Anville in Paris, Wild in London, all documented Tartary, not as speculation, but as established geographic fact. They cited travelers, merchants, and diplomatic missions that crossed those territories. They recorded cities, rivers, and mountain ranges within Tartarian boundaries. Their maps were not works of imagination, but attempts at systematic representation of known geography. This raises a possibility that conventional history addresses inadequately. Perhaps Tartary was not merely a geographic label applied loosely to unknown territories, but recognition of something more unified, not necessarily a single empire in the political sense, but a cultural sphere, a network of cities and peoples connected by trade routes, shared technologies, and architectural traditions. A civilization whose extent and sophistication were understood, however imperfectly, by European scholars who documented it on their maps. And perhaps its disappearance from those maps represents not simply the refinement of geographic knowledge, but the erasure of an inconvenient memory. If the maps preserved the name, then the travelers who crossed those lands preserved something else, descriptions of what they found there, accounts of cities and technologies that challenge the narrative of steady progress from primitive to modern. To understand whether Tartary was merely a label or represented a civilization, we must examine the testimony of those who claim to have seen it firsthand, the written record of what existed in those territories before the name vanished and the memory began to fade. Imagine you are reading a 13th century manuscript by candlelight, following the route of a Venetian merchant into the heart of Asia. Marco Polo, writing from a Genoese prison in 1298, described vast kingdoms beyond the Mongol territories, cities of marble and gold, postal systems spanning thousands of kilometers, and technologies that would not reach Europe for centuries. He called the region Tartary, and he was not alone. Across the medieval and early modern periods, travelers from multiple civilizations documented their passages through these territories, leaving accounts that share a striking consistency in what they observed and how they described it. Polo's narrative, dictated to the Romance writer Rustichello da Pisa during his imprisonment, covered approximately 17 years of travel through Asia. Much of his account focuses on the court of Kublai Khan and the Mongol administrative system, but significant portions describe territories beyond direct Mongol control, regions he identified as Tartarian. He wrote of cities with populations exceeding anything in contemporary Europe, organized around central markets and connected by roads maintained for imperial communication. The postal relay system he documented allowed messages to travel up to 400 kilometers in a single day through a network of stations positioned at regular intervals. Riders changed horses at each station, maintaining constant speed across distances that would take weeks by conventional travel. The technological sophistication Polo described extended beyond logistics. He noted the use of paper currency, a concept unknown in Europe at the time, issued by the Khan's treasury and accepted across territories spanning thousands of kilometers. He documented coal being burned for heat, a fuel source Europeans would not adopt widely for centuries. He described mechanical clocks, advanced metallurgy, and textile production methods that produced fabrics of exceptional quality. His account of gunpowder weapons predates their appearance in European warfare by several generations. Whether Polo personally witnessed all he described remains debated, but his details about technologies and organizational systems align with Chinese sources from the same period, suggesting accuracy in at least the broad outlines of what he documented. 50 years after Polo's travels, another merchant explorer crossed similar territories from a different direction. Ibn Battuta, born in Tangier in 1304, spent nearly 30 years traveling across Africa, the Middle East, India, and Central Asia. His Rila, the account of his journeys, includes extensive descriptions of the cities he called Tartarian. Arriving in Samarkand around 1333, he found a city of grand mosques, bustling markets, and sophisticated water management systems that brought irrigation to gardens and agricultural lands surrounding the urban core. He described Bukhara as a center of learning, its libraries preserving texts in multiple languages, its scholars engaged in astronomy, mathematics, and medicine. What stands out in Ibn Battuta's account is his matter-of-fact tone. He does not describe these cities as exotic or primitive, but as peers to the great urban centers of the Islamic world he knew from Cairo, Damascus, and Baghdad. The architecture impressed him, particularly the scale and decoration of public buildings. The administrative organization functioned efficiently, with officials maintaining records, collecting taxes, and enforcing legal codes. The trade networks connected these cities to India, China, Persia, and through intermediaries to Europe. Ibn Battuta traveled those routes as a merchant and jurist, participating in the commercial and intellectual exchanges that defined these urban centers during the 14th century. A century earlier, a different kind of traveler had documented similar observations from yet another perspective. William of Rubruck, a Franciscan friar, undertook a diplomatic and missionary journey to the Mongol court in 1253 on behalf of King Louis XI of France. His account, preserved in a detailed letter to the French king, provides systematic descriptions of the peoples, customs, and technologies he encountered. Rubruck noted advanced metallurgical techniques, including the production of iron and steel in quantities that suggested industrial-scale operations. He described felt-making processes, leather treatment methods, and the construction of portable dwellings engineered to withstand extreme weather while remaining mobile. More significantly, Rubruck documented the administrative sophistication of the territories he traveled through. Official documents were produced in multiple languages using standardized formats. Legal disputes were adjudicated according to established codes. Diplomatic protocols governed interactions between the Mongol court and foreign visitors, suggesting a bureaucratic structure more elaborate than anything in contemporary Europe. The postal relay system Polo would later describe was already functioning when Rubruck traveled, allowing the Khan's orders to reach distant territories within days. Rubruck, writing as a missionary, had no reason to exaggerate the capabilities of peoples he hoped to convert. His account serves as straightforward observation, valuable precisely because it lacks the embellishment typical of medieval travel narratives. Russian chronicles from the same period add another layer to this documentary evidence. The primary chronicle and later compilations record interactions between Russian principalities and the peoples they identified as Tatars or Tartars from the 13th century onward. These accounts describe not only military conflicts, but trade relationships, diplomatic exchanges, and cultural contacts. Russian merchants traveled regularly into Tartarian territories, returning with goods, technologies, and information about the lands beyond the frontier. The chronicles mention cities, describe political structures, and note the movement of armies and populations across vast distances with a level of organization that required sophisticated logistical planning. Across these accounts from different centuries, cultures, and purposes, certain details recur with uncanny consistency. The postal relay systems appear in multiple sources, described with similar specifics about distances, timing, and organization. The cities are invariably portrayed as substantial urban centers, not temporary encampments. Advanced technologies appear repeatedly in accounts separated by decades and written by observers with no contact with each other. The administrative sophistication impresses every traveler who documents it, whether merchant, missionary, or scholar. What makes these convergent descriptions compelling is their mundane character. None of these travelers describe Tartary as a mythical realm or exotic fantasy. They document it as a functioning geographic and cultural space, different from their homelands, but comprehensible within frameworks of urban civilization, political organization, and technological development. When Polo describes paper currency, he explains its function and acceptance. When Ibn Battuta notes irrigation systems, he details their construction and operation. When Rubruck documents metallurgy, he describes the processes he observed. These are not legends, but attempts at systematic description. Yet somewhere between the 17th century, when these accounts were still cited as authoritative references in European scholarship, and the 20th century, when Tartary disappeared From historical consciousness, a rupture occurred. The same sources that medieval and early modern scholars consulted as reliable testimony about Central Asian geography and culture came to be dismissed as exaggerated, confused, or unreliable. Polo's narrative was questioned for its omissions and apparent errors. Ibn Battuta's descriptions were treated as colored by his Muslim perspective. Rubruk's observations were reinterpreted through frameworks that minimized the sophistication of the societies he encountered. The accumulated testimony of centuries of travelers was gradually discounted in favor of narratives that portrayed the regions they described as backwards, primitive, or historically insignificant until Russian and later Soviet modernization. This transformation in how the sources were read parallels the disappearance of Tartary from the maps. As the name vanished from cartographic practice, the historical accounts that had documented what existed in those territories lost their authority. The travelers had recorded what they saw with their eyes, preserved in manuscripts and chronicles that survive in archives across Europe and Asia. But perhaps the most puzzling evidence lies not in what they wrote, but in what still stands. Buildings that share architectural signatures across thousands of kilometers, structures whose construction timelines and technological sophistication raise questions that conventional histories struggle to answer. To test whether Tartary represented a unified civilization, we must examine the physical structures that survive across its former territories. In the archives of San Francisco, a photograph dated 1915 shows a city of white palaces rising from the earth. Domed exhibition halls, columned pavilions, and towers of intricate stonework stretch across 635 acres along the bay. The structures exhibit classical proportions, ornate facades with detailed relief work, and massive domes that dominate the skyline. The caption reads, "Panama Pacific International Exposition." According to official records, this entire complex was conceived, designed, and constructed in just 3 years, from initial planning in 1912 to the exposition's opening in February 1915. Then, within months of the fair's closing in December of that year, the buildings were demolished. Nearly all of them. The Palace of Fine Arts survived, its Roman columns and rotunda still standing today, constructed from materials that belie any designation as temporary. This pattern repeats across the late 19th and early 20th centuries. The World's Columbian Exposition opened in Chicago in 1893 after 2 years of construction, covering 690 acres with over 200 buildings designed in the Beaux-Arts style. Photographs show structures with elaborate plasterwork, massive scale, and architectural sophistication rivaling permanent civic buildings. The fair closed in October 1893, and most structures were demolished by the following spring. The Pan American Exposition opened in Buffalo in 1901 after 2 years of planning and construction, featuring elaborate electrical illumination systems and buildings covering 350 acres. It closed 6 months later, and demolition began immediately. The Louisiana Purchase Exposition in St. Louis consumed 3 years from concept to completion in 1904, creating buildings across 172 acres that housed exhibitions from 62 nations. When it closed in December, the majority of structures were dismantled. The official explanation holds that these were temporary structures, built from staff, a mixture of plaster and fiber, designed to mimic stone, but lacking durability. The scale and speed made economic sense for short-term use. Constructing permanent buildings would have been prohibitively expensive for events lasting only months. Yet photographs of the construction process raise questions. The Palace of Machinery at the 1893 Chicago Fair measured 842 feet long by 380 feet wide, with a roof supported by massive trusses spanning the entire width without interior columns. Modern structural engineers examining the photographs note that such a span required sophisticated understanding of load distribution, material stress, and wind resistance. The building was supposedly designed and erected in under 2 years. The consistency of architectural vocabulary across these expositions suggests coordination beyond simple stylistic trends. The domes exhibit identical proportional systems. The ratio of dome height to base diameter appears repeatedly across different fairs in different cities, approximately 1 to 1.618, the golden ratio that has governed architectural proportions since antiquity. The facades share specific patterns of fenestration, window arrangements repeating with mathematical precision. Columns follow classical orders, not approximately, but exactly, with measurements matching those specified in Renaissance architectural treatises. The distances between pilasters, the heights of entablatures, the proportions of pediments conform to systems that required years of study to master and apply correctly. Beyond the world's fairs, other buildings from the same period exhibit similar peculiarities. San Francisco's City Hall, supposedly rebuilt in 3 years following the 1906 earthquake and fire, features a dome that rises 307 feet from ground level, making it one of the tallest in the world at the time of its completion in 1915. The structure required 7,900 tons of structural steel and extensive masonry work. Modern construction estimates for comparable buildings suggest timelines of 7 to 10 years. Chicago, rebuilt after the Great Fire of 1871, saw the construction of dozens of monumental buildings through the 1880s and 1890s, each supposedly erected in 2 to 4 years despite their scale and ornate detailing. The Auditorium building, completed in 1889, contained 4,300 rooms and a theatre with acoustic properties that still impress modern engineers, built in just 4 years according to official records. The basement anomalies add another layer of complexity. Photographs from multiple cities show buildings whose ground floors have been buried. Their original entrances now basement windows below modern street level. In Seattle, storefronts photographed in the 1870s align with street grade. The same buildings photographed in the 1890s show those entrances buried beneath 3 to 5 feet of fill, with new entrances constructed 1 level higher. Official histories attribute this to deliberate street raising, claiming the city built retaining walls and filled in the spaces to elevate streets above the tidal mudflats. Yet similar patterns appear in cities without comparable geographic justifications. In Chicago, numerous buildings from the 1880s show buried first floors. In parts of New York, London, and Moscow, the same phenomenon appears in photographs from the same approximate period. The architectural consistency extends to former Tartarian territories. Buildings in St. Petersburg, constructed between 1850 and 1900, share the same proportional systems seen in Western European and American structures from the same decades. The Kazan Cathedral, completed in 1811, but representative of the architectural vocabulary used throughout the century, exhibits the identical dome ratios, facade patterns, and classical proportions seen in buildings thousands of kilometers to the west. Samarkand's Registan, though dating to earlier centuries, was extensively renovated during the late 1800s, and photographs from the period show craftsmen working on structures whose architectural sophistication matches contemporaneous European work. The buildings share more than general style. They share specific geometric relationships, proportional systems, and construction techniques. Modern construction analysis raises further questions. The amount of skilled labor required for the level of ornamentation visible in World's Fair photographs exceeds what could plausibly have been assembled for 2-year projects. Master plasterers, stone carvers, and artisans capable of producing the relief work visible on these facades typically trained for years to achieve such skill. The volume of such work suggests either unprecedented mobilization of craftsmen or techniques that allowed faster production than modern methods achieve. Structural engineering analysis of the spans, roof systems, and foundations indicates knowledge of load calculations and material properties that supposedly emerged only gradually through the 19th century, yet appears fully formed in buildings from across that period. The designation of these structures as temporary masks their material reality. Staff, the plaster mixture cited in official accounts, appears in some photographs of wall construction. Yet the surviving Palace of Fine Arts in San Francisco was supposedly built from the same temporary materials, and it has stood for over a century with minimal structural intervention. The foundations visible in excavation photographs show masonry work, concrete footings, and infrastructure, suggesting permanence rather than temporary installation. Buildings supposedly designed to last months were constructed with drainage systems, electrical conduits, and structural supports built to standards appropriate for decades of use. Perhaps these structures were not built in the timelines claimed, but restored or repurposed. Perhaps an existing architectural vocabulary was being applied, not invented, by the builders of the 19th century. The consistency across continents and the sophistication appearing in such concentrated form during a narrow historical window suggests either global coordination unprecedented in human history or access to architectural knowledge that predated the specific buildings in question. The World's Fair narrative provided a convenient explanation for structures that might otherwise raise uncomfortable questions about continuity with an earlier building tradition. Architecture preserves memory in physical form, encoded in proportions and patterns that survive long after their origins are forgotten. But beneath those structures lies another kind of evidence, written in layers of earth that record rapid transformation. To understand whether a catastrophic event could explain both the architectural uniformity and the apparent sudden appearance of these buildings, we must examine what is called the mud flood hypothesis, a pattern of sediment deposition that appears across multiple continents in the same historical moment, captured in the photographs themselves. In cities across the world, a pattern emerges in 19th century photographs. Buildings photographed in the 1860s show ground-level entrances aligned with the street. The same buildings photographed in the 1890s show those former entrances buried beneath several feet of earth. Now basement windows, with new entrances built a floor above. In Seattle, the Pioneer Square district preserves this phenomenon in stark relief. Photographs from 1870 show storefronts at street level. By 1895, those same storefronts lie 3 to 5 feet below the modern sidewalk, accessible only by descending stairs into what are now basement spaces. Official histories attribute this to deliberate street raising, claiming the city built retaining walls and filled the area to elevate streets above the tidal mudflats and improve drainage. Yet the consistency of the phenomenon across geographies that share no common drainage problem suggests a pattern worthy of closer examination. In Chicago, buildings constructed after the 1871 fire show similar burial. Structures photographed in the 1880s with street-level entrances appear in later photographs, with those same entrances submerged beneath accumulated sediment. The Windy City sits on relatively flat terrain, well above any floodplain, yet the burial pattern matches Seattle's. In New York, portions of Lower Manhattan exhibit the same transformation between the 1860s and 1890s. European cities show comparable evidence. Parts of London, particularly areas rebuilt after mid-century development, display buildings whose original ground floors now function as basements. Photographs from St. Petersburg, Moscow, and other Russian cities document identical patterns during the same decades. The depths involved are remarkably consistent. Measurements taken from photographic analysis suggest burial ranging from 3 to 8 feet, with most examples clustering around 4 to 6 feet. This uniformity across different cities, climates, and geographic settings is striking. If each city had independently undertaken street raising as a municipal improvement project, we might expect variation in depth, timing, and method. Instead, the same approximate depth appears in the same narrow time window across multiple continents. The official explanation of deliberate urban development faces a challenge when the pattern repeats in locations where no documented street-raising campaigns occurred, or where the official records describe more modest modifications than the photographic evidence suggests. An alternative interpretation proposes rapid sediment deposition events during the mid to late 19th century. This hypothesis suggests that natural catastrophes, rather than planned urban development, buried the first floors of existing structures, forcing cities to adapt by building new entrances at the elevated ground level. The mechanism proposed involves a combination of volcanic activity, climatic disruption, and resulting sediment transport that would have deposited material rapidly across wide geographic areas. To evaluate this possibility requires examining the climatological and geological record for the period in question. The year 1816 is remembered as the year without a summer. The eruption of Mount Tambora in Indonesia in April 1815 ejected approximately 160 cubic kilometers of material into the atmosphere, the largest volcanic eruption in recorded history. The atmospheric effects were profound. Average global temperatures dropped by approximately 0.5 to 1.0 degrees Celsius in 1816. In Europe and North America, snow fell in June. Crops failed across the Northern Hemisphere. Famine affected regions from New England to China. The ash and sulfur dioxide aerosols circulated in the upper atmosphere for years, creating spectacular sunsets and persistent atmospheric haze documented in paintings and written accounts from the period. Tambora was not the only significant eruption of the century. Krakatoa exploded in 1883, producing global atmospheric effects and tsunamis that killed tens of thousands. The eruption ejected approximately 25 cubic kilometers of material and was heard 40,800 kilometers away. Ash fell across a vast area, and the atmospheric dust circled the globe, reducing temperatures and creating vivid red sunsets for years. Between these massive, events, dozens of smaller but still significant eruptions occurred throughout the 19th century, each contributing volcanic ash, dust, and aerosols to the atmosphere. The cumulative effect maintained a baseline of atmospheric particulate matter far above pre-industrial levels. The climatic consequences of this volcanic activity extended beyond temperature reduction. Increased atmospheric particulates altered precipitation patterns. Historical weather records from the period document unusual rainfall, severe storms, and flooding events with greater frequency than the centuries preceding or following. Tree ring analysis from locations across the Northern Hemisphere shows growth pattern disruptions during the early and mid-1800s, indicating environmental stress consistent with climatic instability. Ice core samples from Greenland preserve layers from this period showing elevated sulfur concentrations and volcanic ash particles, confirming the global distribution of volcanic materials. Under such conditions, rapid sediment deposition becomes plausible through several mechanisms. Volcanic ash settling from the atmosphere could accumulate directly, though this alone would not account for the depths observed. More significantly, disrupted precipitation patterns could mobilize existing sediments. Heavy rains falling on landscapes stripped of vegetation by temperature drops and crop failures would erode topsoil at accelerated rates. Rivers swollen by unusual precipitation would carry sediment loads, far exceeding normal levels, depositing material when they overflowed banks or reached urban areas. Dust storms, documented in the historical accounts from the period, could transport fine particles across vast distances, depositing them wherever precipitation brought them to ground. Geological surveys of urban sediment layers provide some support for rapid deposition scenarios. Excavations in Seattle's underground areas reveal sediment composition consistent with flood deposits rather than deliberately placed fill. The material contains organic matter, ash particles, and fine sediments characteristic of water-transported deposition. Similar compositions appear in excavations beneath Chicago streets, where layers dated to the mid to late 1800s show characteristics suggesting rapid accumulation rather than gradual build-up. In European cities, archaeological investigations of buried medieval and early modern structures occasionally reveal sediment layers whose texture and composition indicate flood deposition. The question remains whether volcanic and climatic factors alone could produce the observed burial depths in the timeframes suggested. Modern geological understanding indicates that catastrophic flooding can indeed deposit several feet of sediment in single events. The 2004 Indian Ocean tsunami left sediment layers up to 1 meter thick in some coastal areas. The 1889 Johnstown flood in Pennsylvania deposited similar depths across the flooded valley. River floods throughout history have left measurable sediment layers in floodplains and low-lying areas. The mechanism exists and operates at scales comparable to what the photographic evidence documents. However, the distribution pattern poses challenges for a simple flooding explanation. The burial phenomenon appears in cities at various elevations, in different climatic zones, and in locations not obviously connected by shared river systems or flood routes. A single catastrophic event seems insufficient to explain burial in Seattle, Chicago, New York, London, and Moscow simultaneously. Multiple regional events spread across several decades appears more consistent with the evidence, yet this raises questions about what environmental conditions would produce such a pattern globally during one specific historical period. Perhaps the most puzzling aspect involves the apparent lack of contemporary documentation for catastrophic flooding events sufficient to bury first floors across entire city districts. Historical newspapers, municipal records, and personal diaries from the period describe floods and storms, certainly, but rarely in terms suggesting the scale of sediment deposition the photographs document. If cities experienced flooding dramatic enough to bury street-level structures under several feet of sediment, we might expect more extensive written testimony about such transformative events. The relative silence in the historical record contrasts with the physical evidence preserved in photographs and the buried structures themselves. One possible resolution involves timescale. If sediment accumulated not in single catastrophic events, but through repeated, smaller episodes spread across 2 to 3 decades, contemporary observers might not have perceived it as a dramatic transformation. A few inches of sediment deposited annually, combined with periodic, heavier deposition during severe storms, could produce the observed depths over a generation without any single event rising to the level of historical catastrophe. The gradual nature of the accumulation might explain why cities adapted by modifying their buildings rather than attempting large-scale sediment removal, and why the process left less dramatic imprint in written records than in the physical landscape. The mud flood hypothesis remains unproven in conventional geological frameworks. Standard explanations emphasizing deliberate urban development account for much of the evidence through documented street-raising projects, particularly in cities like Seattle, where such improvements were planned and executed. Yet the photographic record preserves patterns that stretch beyond what official histories fully explain. Buildings across multiple continents show the same type of burial occurring in the same narrow historical window, during a period when volcanic activity and climatic disruption created conditions favorable for unusual sediment transport and deposition. Whether this represents coordinated urban development, a series of regional catastrophes, or something more complex, the 19th century emerges as a period of dramatic physical transformation that standard histories often understate. The question of what buried these structures connects to larger questions about the buildings themselves. Physical evidence in stone, sediment, and earth tells one story, but the technologies embedded in these structures tell another. The sophistication attributed to 19th century innovation itself demands scrutiny when examined against the timelines claimed and the systematic nature of the knowledge suddenly appearing across the globe. From buried foundations, we must look upward to what was built and ask whether the architectural and technological systems we observe represent invention or inheritance. Stand inside the main hall of the Palais Garnier in Paris and speak in a normal voice from the stage. Your words will reach the furthest balcony with perfect clarity, amplified by the room's geometry alone. No electronic equipment, no modern acoustics consulting. Just stone, proportion, and knowledge. The building opened in 1875, designed by Charles Garnier, who was 35 years old when he won the commission in a competition judged by Napoleon III. European society in 1860 possessed limited understanding of wave mechanics, sound propagation, or the mathematical relationships governing acoustic resonance. Yet Garnier's opera house achieves acoustic performance that rival spaces designed with computer modeling today. The question is not whether the result impresses, but how such precision emerged from an era supposedly just beginning to grasp the scientific principles involved. The acoustic sophistication appears across multiple 19th century performance spaces with remarkable consistency. Carnegie Hall, opened in New York in 1891, exhibits similarly exceptional sound quality. Architects and musicians still study its acoustic properties, attempting to understand how a hall designed before systematic acoustical engineering produces results superior to many modern concert venues built with advanced analysis tools. The Vienna Musikverein, completed in 1870, demonstrates the same characteristics. Boston Symphony Hall, finished in 1900, applied emerging acoustic theory developed by physicist Wallace Sabine, yet earlier halls built without his calculations match or exceed its performance. The knowledge encoded in these spaces seems to predate the theoretical frameworks used to explain them. The architectural features that produce these acoustic effects follow patterns that repeat across buildings separated by thousands of kilometers. The ratio of hall length to width to height appears consistently within narrow ranges. The Vienna Musikverein measures approximately 1.0 to 0.9 to 0.8 in those proportions. Carnegie Hall's dimensions fall within similar relationships. The Palais Garnier, though architecturally distinct, employs comparable spatial ratios in its auditorium. The ceiling designs incorporate coffers, domes, and geometric patterns positioned to scatter and diffuse sound in ways that modern acoustic engineers recognize as optimal for tonal balance and clarity. Yet these features appear in buildings constructed before the mathematics describing sound diffusion were formalized. Beyond acoustics, the climate control systems embedded in 19th century architecture demonstrate sophisticated understanding of thermodynamics and fluid dynamics. The Natural History Museum in London, completed in 1881, employs a passive ventilation system that maintains relatively stable temperature and humidity without mechanical equipment. Air enters through vents at ground level, warms as it rises through the building, and exhausts through towers and cupolas at the roof. The system creates continuous airflow that prevents stagnation while moderating temperature extremes. Similar principles appear in the design of the United States Capitol building, where a network of ducts, vents, and chambers created climate control sufficient for a structure housing hundreds of people in Washington's humid summers and cold winters. Victorian architects published treatises describing these systems, attributing them to application of known physical principles. Yet the precision of implementation suggests either extensive trial and error or access to refined techniques developed through generations of practice. The U.S. Capitol's ventilation system, installed during renovations in the 1850s, required calculations of air volume, flow rates, temperature differentials, and pressure dynamics. Modern engineers examining the historical plans note that achieving functional climate control without powered fans demanded understanding of principles that would not be rigorously formalized until decades later. The Capitol's designer, Thomas U. Walter, produced a system that worked immediately upon installation, suggesting knowledge beyond what contemporary scientific literature would have provided. The electrical infrastructure poses perhaps the most significant anomaly. Photographs of the 1893 World's Columbian Exposition in Chicago show buildings covered in electric lights, powered by a central generating station that supplied current throughout the fairgrounds. The exposition opened just 11 years after Thomas Edison's Pearl Street Station began commercial electricity distribution in New York, and only 4 years after the first large-scale AC power system began operation. Yet the Chicago Fair's electrical system distributed power across 690 acres to illuminate thousands of lights, operate fountains, and run machinery. The rapid deployment of such extensive electrical infrastructure suggests either unprecedented mobilization of expertise or application of knowledge already refined beyond what the technology's recent invention would imply. More puzzling are the architectural provisions for electricity in buildings that predate widespread electrical adoption. Structures built in the 1870s and 1880s, before electrical systems became standard, often contain conduits, channels, and mounting points clearly intended for electrical wiring. Some buildings exhibit these features in locations that would have been inaccessible for retrofitting, suggesting they were incorporated during original construction. The phenomenon appears across multiple cities and building types, as though architects anticipated electrical systems before those systems achieved commercial viability. Standard architectural history explains this through foresight and planning for future installation. Yet the specificity and consistency of these provisions suggests familiarity with electrical distribution requirements before those requirements were supposedly established. The World's Fairs themselves featured technologies whose sudden appearance and subsequent disappearance raise questions about developmental continuity. The 1893 Chicago Exposition displayed elaborate systems of electric lights arranged on towers, domes, and building facades in patterns that served no obvious functional purpose beyond illumination. Some towers reached heights of over 200 feet, topped with globes, spires, or ornamental features that contemporary accounts describe as producing atmospheric effects. The 1901 Buffalo Exposition featured similar installations, including a central electric tower rising 375 feet and covered in lights powered by Nikola Tesla's alternating current system, drawing power from Niagara Falls. Photographs show antenna-like structures, conducting elements, and configurations that some researchers interpret as attempts to harness or demonstrate atmospheric electricity principles. Tesla himself filed patents throughout the 1890s and early 1900s for wireless power transmission, systems designed to distribute electrical energy through the atmosphere without wires. His Wardenclyffe Tower project, begun in 1901, aimed to implement these concepts at scale. The tower reached 187 feet in height, supported by a foundation extending 120 feet into the earth, and incorporated extensive copper grounding systems. Tesla claimed the installation could transmit power wirelessly across vast distances by utilizing the earth itself as a conductor. The project was abandoned incomplete in 1906 when funding ceased, but the architectural and engineering elements suggest serious attempt at functional application rather than speculative experimentation. The architectural ornament on many 19th century buildings includes features whose decorative appearance may mask functional purposes. Domes topped with elaborate finials often incorporate metal elements extending above the structure. The United States Capitol Dome features a bronze Statue of Freedom reaching 288 feet above ground level, but the internal structure includes metal framework and conducting elements that extend the full height. State, Capitol buildings across America exhibit similar features, with conductive elements incorporated into apparently decorative crowns, finials, and ornamental metalwork. Whether these elements served purposes beyond aesthetics remains disputed, but their consistent appearance across government and civic buildings built during the same decades suggests standardization of design elements whose functions were understood by the architects who specified them. The timeline of technological innovation in the 1880s and 1890s compressed developments that conventionally require longer periods. The telephone, electric light, phonograph, motion pictures, and wireless communication all emerged or achieved practical implementation within roughly 15 years. Patents filed during this period often describe technologies in refined form, with detailed specifications suggesting extensive prior development. Yet the historical record provides limited documentation of the experimental phases typically necessary to move from concept to implementation. Tesla's patents for polyphase AC systems appear in 1888, fully developed, enabling immediate commercial application. Edison's patents show similar characteristics, describing devices ready for manufacture rather than requiring further refinement. This concentration of innovation coincides with the period of massive architectural development and the World's Fair phenomenon. The same decades that saw hundreds of monumental buildings erected also produced the fundamental electrical and mechanical technologies that would define the 20th century. Whether this represents genuine simultaneous innovation, delayed publication of earlier discoveries, or rediscovery of previously known principles remains debated. The systematic nature of the knowledge suggests coordination or common source, rather than independent parallel development across continents. From a modern engineering perspective, the buildings of the late 19th century encode principles that supposedly emerged gradually through scientific discovery and industrial application. Yet those principles appear simultaneously across diverse building types and locations, implemented with precision suggesting mature understanding rather than experimental application. The acoustic perfection of performance halls, the sophisticated climate control systems, the electrical provisions anticipating technologies not yet commercially viable, and the ornamental features potentially serving technical functions all point toward knowledge more comprehensive than conventional historical narratives accommodate. The paradox compounds when examining buildings in former Tartarian territories. Structures in St. Petersburg, Kazan, and other Central Asian cities exhibit the same technological sophistication as their Western counterparts from the same period. The Kazan Cathedral's ventilation systems, the Moscow metro station's acoustic properties, and the electrical infrastructure provisions in buildings across the former Russian Empire match patterns seen in Chicago, Paris, and New York. Either knowledge diffused with unprecedented speed across political boundaries, or the buildings across these territories drew from common templates that predated the specific construction dates. Technology does not emerge fully formed. It develops through iterations, failures, refinements, and accumulated practical experience. The 19th century produced technological advancement at a pace that, when examined closely, seems to violate this principle. Functional systems appeared rapidly, performed reliably, and spread globally within timeframes shorter than their apparent complexity would require. Whether this rapid deployment represents suppressed earlier development, parallel discovery across continents, or application of inherited knowledge, it indicates that the technological history of the period may be more complex than standard narratives suggest. The buildings stand as evidence, their systems still functioning, encoding knowledge in proportion and pattern that continues to impress those who study them with modern analytical tools. The systematic sophistication embedded in these structures demands explanation. Technologies and buildings provide one form of evidence, constructed objects that can be measured and analyzed. But if Tartary represented a civilization rather than merely a geographic designation, we should expect to find other traces, physical sites, ruins, and archaeological evidence marking the presence of a unified culture across those territories. That search leads into systematic silence, gaps in investigation that themselves tell a story about how archaeology is practiced and what questions are deemed worth asking. By 1890, the word Tartary had become an embarrassment to European cartographers. Encyclopedias that once dedicated entire sections to Tartarian geography now relegated it to footnotes or omitted it entirely. In its place appeared new terms: Russian Turkestan, Chinese Turkestan, Mongolia, Manchuria, the steppe region, Central Asia. The territories had not changed. The political boundaries had not fundamentally shifted in ways that would necessitate complete terminological replacement. But the name had become unusable, marked as archaic at best, ignorant at worst. To speak of Tartary was to identify oneself as out of touch with modern geographic knowledge, clinging to outdated concepts that progressive scholarship had superseded. The linguistic erasure was so thorough that within 2 generations, the word survived primarily in the phrase "caught a Tartar," meaning to encounter unexpected difficulty, an idiom whose origins few speakers could explain. The transformation began with language itself. Tartary derived from Tatar, the designation for Turkic and Mongol peoples who dominated the Central Asian steppes. Yet European writers increasingly spelled and pronounced the term as Tartar, consciously or unconsciously, invoking Tartarus, the Greek conception of hell, the abyss beneath Hades where the wicked suffered eternal punishment. This linguistic shift was not accidental. Medieval European chroniclers, traumatized by Mongol invasions, had already associated Eastern peoples with infernal forces. By the 19th century, this association solidified into standard usage. The Tatars became Tartars, and their homeland became implicitly hellish, a region of darkness and barbarism, rather than a geographic designation carrying neutral or positive connotations. This semantic transformation coincided with European colonial expansion across Central Asia. Throughout the 19th century, the Russian Empire pushed eastward and southward, absorbing territories that had operated with varying degrees of independence. The British Empire extended influence northward from India, seeking to establish buffers against Russian expansion. The competition between these powers, known as the Great Game, required ideological justification. Colonialism operates more smoothly when the colonized are portrayed as backward, disorganized, and in need of civilizing influence. A unified region called Tartary, especially one that historical sources described as sophisticated and organized, complicated that narrative. Fragmentation served multiple purposes. It created administrative units manageable by colonial bureaucracy, and it dissolved any sense of regional coherence that might support resistance to external control. The maps reflected this fragmentation with increasing specificity. Where earlier, cartographers had drawn broad regions labelled simply as Tartary, late 19th century maps divided the same territories into detailed administrative units. Each subdivision received its own designation tied to the colonial power claiming authority. Russian Turkestan, established formally in 1867, covered territories recently conquered by Russia. Chinese Turkestan referred to regions under Qing administration. British maps marked Afghanistan, Tibet, and buffer zones, according to spheres of influence negotiated in diplomatic agreements. The cumulative effect made Tartary seem like a crude generalization, an artifact of less sophisticated geography, when in fact earlier usage may have reflected a cultural or political reality that colonialism deliberately obscured. Parallel to colonial expansion, European nationalism was reshaping how history itself was conceived and written. The 19th century saw the professionalization of history as an academic discipline, with standards, methodologies, and institutional structures that defined legitimate historical inquiry. This new academic history served nationalist projects. Each European nation sought origin narratives that validated its contemporary claims to territory, culture, and superiority. These narratives required clear genealogies connecting modern nations to ancient glories, preferably with minimal acknowledgement of cultural exchange, borrowing, or debt to non-European civilizations. In this context, Tartary posed a problem. Its existence implied that sophisticated civilization had flourished in regions that European narratives portrayed as primitive until contact with European culture brought progress. The emerging field of anthropology contributed to this reframing through theories of cultural evolution that arranged human societies in hierarchical stages from savage to civilized. Central Asian peoples, categorized as nomadic or pastoral, were assigned to lower developmental stages regardless of their actual historical complexity. The evidence that earlier travelers had documented, evidence of cities, technologies, and political organization, was reinterpreted through this evolutionary framework. If sophistication existed, it must have been borrowed from settled civilizations, or it represented exceptional cases that proved the rule of nomadic backwardness. The systematic dismissal of evidence that contradicted these hierarchies became standard practice in both anthropology and history. Orientalism, the European framework for understanding Asian cultures, analyzed by scholar Edward Said in his 1978 work of the same name, operated powerfully in how Tartary was reconceived. European writers and scholars constructed an image of the Orient as mysterious, backward, despotic, and fundamentally different from the rational, progressive West. Central Asian peoples fit awkwardly into this construction because historical sources depicted them as militarily formidable, politically organized, and culturally sophisticated. The solution was to reframe the historical narrative, portraying any past achievements as anomalies or exaggerations, while emphasizing aspects that fit stereotypes of Oriental backwardness. Accounts of great cities became embellishments. Descriptions of technology were dismissed as travelers' tales. The systematic sophistication documented by multiple independent sources was explained away as European projection or misunderstanding. The world's fairs of the late 19th and early 20th centuries both reflected and reinforced these transformations. These expositions explicitly presented civilizational hierarchies, with European and American achievements displayed in grand pavilions, while non-Western peoples were exhibited in ethnographic villages that portrayed them as primitive. The 1893 Chicago World's Fair included a Midway Pleasance, featuring living exhibits of peoples from colonized regions presented as specimens of lower developmental stages. Visitors could observe these displays and contrast them with the gleaming white city of the main exposition, a visual argument for Western superiority. Central Asian peoples appeared in such exhibits not as descendants of sophisticated civilizations, but as examples of backwardness, their material culture selected and presented to confirm rather than challenge European assumptions. Academic publications from the period demonstrate how systematic the reframing became. A comparative study of geographic and historical encyclopedias shows the transformation quantitatively. The 1823 edition of the Edinburgh Encyclopedia devoted 17 pages to Tartary, describing its regions, cities, peoples, and history in detail that treated it as a significant geographic and cultural entity. The 1875 edition of Encyclopaedia Britannica reduced this to 11 pages, with increasing emphasis on its division into Russian and Chinese spheres. The 1911 edition offered only 3 pages, primarily defining Tartary as an obsolete term, with substance devoted to explaining why modern geography no longer recognized it as meaningful. By the 1950s, standard reference works omitted separate entries for Tartary entirely, mentioning it only in historical context as a designation no longer used. Who benefited from this erasure? The question does not require conspiracy, but rather recognition of convergent interests. Colonial administrators needed fragmented territories that could be governed separately rather than unified regions that might resist collectively. Nationalist historians needed narratives that portrayed European civilization as uniquely advanced, achieved without significant debt to other cultures. Anthropologists building careers needed hierarchical frameworks that placed their own societies at the pinnacle of human development. Geographers establishing professional standards needed to distinguish modern scientific cartography from earlier approximations. Each group, pursuing its own objectives, contributed to making Tartary unthinkable as a coherent concept. The tragedy extends beyond what was lost. The tragedy includes how the loss was naturalized, made to seem inevitable and obvious. By the mid-20th century, educated people who encountered Tartary in historical documents often assumed it was a vague European designation for poorly understood territories, a conceptual placeholder that proper geographic knowledge had replaced. The possibility that it might have designated something real, something that later powers had interest in fragmenting and forgetting, rarely entered consideration. The erasure succeeded so completely that questioning it appears eccentric, the domain of fringe theorists, rather than legitimate historical inquiry. Yet the evidence that something substantial existed persists in those earlier sources that took Tartary seriously, the maps that marked it across a third of the world, the travelers who described its cities and systems, the architectural and technological patterns that appear across its former territories, the demographic and cultural traces in populations that still inhabit those regions. This evidence has not disappeared. It has been recontextualized, reinterpreted, and marginalized. but it remains accessible to anyone willing to examine it without presuming that earlier generations were simply confused, or that modern narratives are necessarily more accurate than the historical sources they replaced. The question is not whether the erasure was deliberate in the sense of coordinated conspiracy. The question is whether what was erased existed in forms that made its erasure convenient for powers that reshaped the region in the 19th and 20th centuries. The converging interests of colonialism, nationalism, and academic institution building produced a historical narrative that made Tartary disappear not merely as a name, but as a conceivable historical entity. That narrative has proven remarkably durable, surviving the collapse of the colonial empires that helped create it and persisting in how Central Asian history is taught and understood today. Ideology can reshape how we remember the past, fragmenting what was whole and marginalizing what was central. But some evidence resists reinterpretation. The Earth itself keeps records through geology, climate, and the physical transformations that mark its surface. To test whether Tartary existed as more than a geographic label, whether a catastrophic transformation might explain both its disappearance and the architectural uniformity that preceded that disappearance, we must turn from ideology to what cannot be ideologically altered: the geological record itself, the planetary archive written in layers of rock and ice. Beneath the modern streets of Seattle, workers excavating for a transit tunnel in 2016 discovered something unexpected. At depths that should have corresponded to mid-19th century ground level, they found a distinct layer of uniform sediment, fine particles of volcanic ash mixed with organic matter and what appeared to be fragmented building materials compressed into a stratum several feet thick. Standard geological surveys had not predicted this layer. Its composition suggested rapid deposition rather than gradual accumulation, material laid down in a relatively short period rather than building up slowly over decades. The find was documented, samples were analyzed briefly, and the project continued. Similar layers have appeared in excavations across North America and Europe, all dating to roughly the same period, the middle decades of the 1800s, preserved in the earth like a geological bookmark marking a moment of transformation. Sediment analysis from multiple urban sites reveals patterns that complicate standard narratives of gradual urban development. In Chicago, core samples taken during foundation work for high-rise construction show sediment layers beneath buildings supposedly erected after the 1871 fire. These layers contain volcanic glass particles, microscopic shards that form when molten rock cools rapidly in the atmosphere. The presence of such particles indicates atmospheric deposition of volcanic material, consistent with ash fall from distant eruptions. Similar volcanic signatures appear in sediment cores from New York, Philadelphia, and European cities, including London and Paris. The geographic distribution spans thousands of kilometers, suggesting source eruptions of sufficient magnitude to distribute material globally through upper atmospheric circulation. The volcanic record for the 19th century provides context for these sediment signatures. Mount Tambora's eruption in April 1815 ejected approximately 160 cubic kilometers of material into the atmosphere, the largest volcanic event in recorded history. The eruption column reached an estimated 43 kilometers into the stratosphere, injecting sulfur dioxide and ash particles that circulated globally. Contemporary accounts describe ash falling across the Indonesian archipelago, with darkness persisting for days within a radius of 600 kilometers from the eruption site. The atmospheric effects extended worldwide. The year 1816 became known across Europe and North America as the year without a summer. Snow fell in New England in June. Crops failed across the Northern Hemisphere. Average global temperatures dropped between 0.5 and 1.0 degrees Celsius, with regional variations showing even greater cooling. Tambora was not an isolated event. The 19th century experienced elevated volcanic activity compared to surrounding centuries. In 1883, Krakatoa exploded with force estimated at 200 megatons of TNT, approximately 4 times the yield of the largest thermonuclear weapon ever tested. The eruption was heard 40,800 kilometers away in Perth, Australia. Ash fell across an area of 2.5 million square kilometers. The atmospheric dust circled the globe within 2 weeks, creating vivid red sunsets that painters documented in works across Europe and America. Between these massive events, dozens of smaller but still significant eruptions occurred. Mount St. Helens erupted in 1842 and again in 1857. Several Icelandic volcanoes erupted through the 1870s. Volcanic activity in Indonesia, the Philippines, Japan, and South America maintained elevated levels throughout the century. The cumulative atmospheric impact of this sustained volcanic activity appears in multiple proxy records. Ice cores extracted from Greenland and Antarctica preserve annual layers of snow accumulation that can be dated precisely through counting and correlation with historical events. Analysis of these cores shows elevated sulfur concentrations in layers corresponding to major eruptions, confirming global atmospheric distribution of volcanic aerosols. The 1815 Tambora eruption appears clearly in both Greenland and Antarctic cores, with sulfur spikes occurring in the same seasonal layers despite the distance between the poles. The 1883 Krakatoa eruption similarly registers in ice cores from both hemispheres, demonstrating stratospheric distribution. Tree ring analysis from locations across the Northern Hemisphere provides independent confirmation of environmental stress during the period. Dendrochronology, the study of tree ring patterns, allows reconstruction of growing conditions year by year across centuries. Trees produce wider rings in favorable years with adequate warmth and moisture, narrower rings in stressed conditions. Analysis of long-lived trees from Siberia, North America, and Europe shows synchronized pattern of narrow rings in the years following major volcanic eruptions, particularly 1816 through 1818 and 1884 through 1886. These patterns indicate reduced growing season length, cooler temperatures, or moisture stress affecting forests across vast geographic areas simultaneously. The synchronization across distant locations points to global climatic forcing rather than local conditions. Under such environmental conditions, rapid sediment mobilization and deposition becomes mechanistically plausible. Volcanic ash settling directly from the atmosphere could contribute to surface accumulation, though this alone would not account for the depths observed in urban sediment layers. More significantly, climatic disruption would affect precipitation patterns and vegetation cover. Temperature drops reduce plant growth, leaving soils more vulnerable to erosion. Altered precipitation patterns, whether increased rainfall in some regions or drought in others, mobilize sediments through different mechanisms. Heavy rains falling on poorly vegetated landscapes erode topsoil at accelerated rates. Rivers swollen by unusual precipitation carry sediment loads far exceeding normal levels, depositing material when floodwaters overflow banks or reach low-gradient urban areas. Historical weather records from the period document anomalous conditions consistent with these mechanisms. The years following Tambora saw unprecedented precipitation in parts of Europe, with flooding events recorded in Switzerland, Germany, and France. North American records describe severe storms through the 1810s and 1820s. The decades following Krakatoa similarly show elevated storm frequency and unusual precipitation patterns. Newspaper accounts from cities that later exhibited buried first floors often mention flooding, though rarely at scales that contemporary observers characterized as catastrophic. The accumulated effect of repeated moderate flood events, each depositing inches of sediment, could produce the observed depths over 2 to 3 decades without requiring single dramatic catastrophes. Geological analysis distinguishes rapid deposition from gradual accumulation through sediment characteristics. Flood deposits typically show poor sorting, with particles of varying sizes mixed together as turbulent water carries material of different weights. They often contain organic debris, fragments of vegetation or other materials entrained by flowing water. Layers deposited gradually through years of slow accumulation show better sorting, with particles segregated by size as they settle under calm conditions. The sediment layers found in urban excavations exhibit characteristics more consistent with episodic deposition than gradual buildup, though the evidence remains contested among geologists examining the same samples. Regional variations in sediment evidence suggest localized rather than globally uniform events. The burial phenomenon appears most pronounced in cities at relatively low elevations near water bodies. Coastal cities and those along major rivers show clearer evidence than elevated inland locations. This distribution pattern supports flooding as a primary mechanism, though it does not exclude atmospheric ash deposition as a contributing factor. Cities in different climatic zones show variations in timing and depth of burial, suggesting that while global climatic forcing created conditions favorable for sediment mobilization, the specific events that buried structures occurred regionally over an extended period rather than simultaneously worldwide. Mainstream geological interpretation emphasizes the role of deliberate human activity in creating the observed patterns. Street raising projects are well documented in several cities. Seattle officially raised street levels between 1890 and 1910 to improve drainage and reduce flooding from Puget Sound tides. The historical record includes engineering plans, budgets, and contemporary photographs showing the construction of retaining walls and filling operations. Other cities undertook similar projects for various reasons, from improving sanitation to accommodating new infrastructure. These documented activities account for much of the physical evidence of buried first floors in locations where records survive. Yet the evidence extends beyond cities with clear documentation of street raising. Buildings in locations without recorded engineering projects exhibit similar burial. The timing, concentrated in the mid to late 19th century, coincides with the period of elevated volcanic activity and climatic disruption. The sediment composition in at least some locations shows characteristics more consistent with natural deposition than deliberately placed fill. These factors suggest that while human activity explains part of the observed pattern, Natural processes may have contributed more than standard histories acknowledge, either working independently or accelerating processes that urban development then formalized through street-raising projects. The geological record for the 19th century establishes environmental conditions conducive to rapid landscape transformation, volcanic eruptions, distributed atmospheric particulates globally. Climatic disruption affected vegetation, precipitation, and erosion rates. Flooding events mobilized and deposited sediments. Whether these natural processes alone produce the burial depths visible in photographs, or whether they occurred alongside and masked human activities, the century emerges as a period of significant geological and climatological stress. The Earth itself was in flux, and human societies inhabited a more dynamic environment than the reputation of the 1800s as a period of stability would suggest. From geological strata written in earth and ice, the investigation turns to records written in human populations themselves. Climate catastrophes and geological disruptions leave demographic signatures, patterns of migration, population loss, and social disruption visible in the archives that document births, deaths, and movements of peoples. If the 19th century saw transformations as dramatic as the physical evidence suggests, those transformations should appear in the human record as well, in population data that might reveal disruptions hidden beneath conventional historical narratives. Walk through the downtown district of any major city built between 1850 and 1920, and you will notice something peculiar. The grand buildings, post offices, courthouses, museums, train stations, and state capitals share a vocabulary, not just stylistically in the general sense of neoclassical or Baroque revival, but specifically, mathematically. The same proportional systems govern their dimensions. The same dome designs repeat with precise ratios. The same combinations of columns, arches, and windows arrange themselves in patterns that recur with uncanny consistency across continents. Standard architectural history attributes this to education, to architects trained in European academies, particularly the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris, who brought classical knowledge to their commissions worldwide. Yet the precision of replication suggests something beyond shared training. When buildings in San Francisco, Melbourne, St. Petersburg, and Buenos Aires exhibit identical proportional relationships down to fractions of percentages, academic transmission alone struggles to explain the uniformity. The golden ratio, approximately 1.618 to 1, appears with remarkable frequency in these structures. This mathematical relationship, known since antiquity and encoded in classical architecture, governs proportions considered aesthetically harmonious. Measuring the dimensions of major civic buildings from the period reveals this ratio appearing not approximately but precisely in critical relationships. The dome of the Massachusetts State House, completed in 1798 but representative of proportional systems used throughout the 19th century, exhibits a height-to-diameter ratio of 1.62 to 1. The Texas State Capitol Dome, finished in 1888, shows 1.617 to 1. The dome of San Francisco City Hall measures 1.619 to 1. These are not rough approximations, but calculated implementations of a mathematical principle applied with engineering precision. Facade patterns exhibit similar mathematical consistency. The spacing of windows, the heights of stories, the proportions of pediments and entablatures follow relationships that repeat across unrelated buildings. Analysis of photographic measurements from buildings in different cities reveals window spacing ratios clustering around specific values: 1.5 to 1 for height to width, 2.0 to 1 for spacing to width, 0.611 to 1 for header height to total window height. These relationships appear whether the building stands in Chicago or London, whether constructed in 1870 or 1910, whether designed by American, European, or Russian architects. The consistency transcends what random variation in individual architect preferences would produce. Beyond proportion, astronomical alignments appear in civic architecture with systematic regularity. Buildings oriented to cardinal directions, structures aligned to solstice, sunrise, or sunset, and facades positioned to receive light at specific times on particular dates recur across the architectural landscape of the 19th century. The Utah state capitol in Salt Lake City aligns precisely to true north, as do Capitol buildings in Wisconsin, Minnesota, and numerous other states. This orientation requires surveying precision and intentional design choices, particularly in pre-GPS eras, when establishing true north demanded astronomical observation and calculation. The effort invested suggests purpose beyond aesthetic preference or random orientation. Some buildings incorporate more complex alignments. The Philadelphia City Hall, completed in 1901, positions its tower such that on the spring and autumn equinoxes, shadows cast by the structure align with specific streets radiating from the building. Whether this alignment was intentional or coincidental remains debated, but similar patterns appear in other cities. The Nebraska State Capitol, finished in 1932, but designed in the 1920s following earlier precedents, orients chambers and corridors to receive sunlight at times corresponding to legislative sessions, suggesting functional integration of astronomical awareness into architectural planning. The distinction between architectural style and architectural system becomes critical in analyzing these patterns. Style refers to aesthetic choices, decorative elements, and visual vocabulary that can be taught, copied, and varied by individual designers. System refers to underlying mathematical and geometric relationships, structural principles, and proportional frameworks that govern how elements relate to each other. The 19th century buildings share both style and system, but the systematic elements show less variation than stylistic ones. Two buildings might differ significantly in ornamental detail, material choice, and specific decorative vocabulary, while exhibiting identical proportional relationships in their fundamental dimensions. This suggests that architects worked from templates or guidelines that specified relationships rather than appearances, frameworks that constrain proportion while allowing stylistic freedom. Educational transmission through architectural academies accounts for some of this consistency. The École des Beaux-Arts in Paris trained architects from across Europe and the Americas in classical principles, emphasizing proportion, symmetry, and mathematical relationships derived from ancient Greek and Roman architecture. Graduates of this institution and similar schools carried this knowledge to their home countries, applying it in their designs. Yet the speed and thoroughness with which these principles spread exceeds what institutional education typically achieves. By the 1880s, buildings exhibiting precise implementation of these proportional systems appeared simultaneously in cities across North America, South America, Europe, and Russia, designed by architects with varying levels of formal training, suggesting knowledge sources beyond centralized educational institutions. Examples from former Tartary territories show architectural vocabulary identical to Western counterparts. The Kazan City Hall, completed in 1854, exhibits the same proportional systems, dome ratios, and facade patterns seen in contemporaneous American and European civic buildings. St. Isaac's Cathedral in St. Petersburg, finished in 1858, demonstrates golden ratio relationships in its dimensions and astronomical alignments in its orientation. Buildings across Central Asian cities, renovated or constructed during the late 19th century, incorporate these same geometric principles, whether in Tashkent, Samarkand, or Almaty. The architectural unity extends across the former Tartarian territories and Western nations simultaneously, suggesting either unprecedented coordination or common access to architectural knowledge that transcended political boundaries. Photographic comparisons make the replication visible. Place photographs of the dome structures from state capitals across America side by side, and the identical geometry becomes apparent. The internal structure, the external profile, the proportional relationships between dome height, drum diameter, and lantern dimensions repeat with minimal variation. Similarly, compare courthouse facades from cities separated by thousands of kilometers. The same window arrangements, the same column spacing, the same pediment angles. The replication goes beyond general similarity to specific identity in geometric relationships. If architects were working independently from classical sources, some variation in interpretation would be expected. Instead, the implementations match as though produced from identical specifications. Ornamental elements present another layer of consistency. Specific decorative motifs appear across buildings, with frequencies suggesting standardization. The acanthus leaf pattern on column capitals, the egg and dart molding on cornices, the dentil patterns in friezes all follow prescribed forms with limited variation. More intriguing are elements whose decorative appearance may mask functional characteristics. Metal finials, often elaborately designed and prominently positioned atop domes and towers, incorporate conductive materials and sometimes connect to internal metal frameworks. Ventilation cupolas, positioned at roof peaks, often include metal elements extending above the structure. Whether these features served purposes beyond ornamentation, such as lightning protection, electromagnetic grounding, or other functions, remains subject to interpretation, but their consistent appearance across diverse buildings suggests architects understood them as necessary components rather than optional decoration. The question becomes whether academic training can fully explain precision of this magnitude, distributed this widely in such a compressed timeframe. Consider the alternative, that architects of the late 19th century were not inventing or learning these systems anew, but applying knowledge already codified, working from architectural templates or pattern books that specified proportions, alignments, and geometric relationships developed through generations of refinement. Such templates would explain both the precision and the speed of implementation. They would account for why buildings exhibit systematic consistency despite stylistic variations. They would clarify how architects with varying levels of formal training produced results conforming to identical mathematical principles. If such templates existed, their origins pose the critical question. Standard architectural history traces them to Renaissance recoveries of classical knowledge, to Vitruvius and other ancient sources filtered through centuries of European scholarship. Yet the particular combinations of proportions, the specific astronomical alignments, and the systematic nature of implementation during the 19th century suggest either a coordinated institutional effort to standardize architectural practice globally, or preservation and application of architectural knowledge from a source that predated the specific buildings in question. The buildings themselves encode the answer in their proportions and patterns, waiting for systematic analysis that measures not just individual structures, but the relationships between structures across geographic and temporal scales. What remains undeniable is that the architectural vocabulary of the late 19th century exhibits coherence that requires explanation. The golden ratios are not approximate but precise. The astronomical alignments are not random but systematic. The proportional relationships are not variable but standardized. Whether this represents the triumph of academic architecture, the efficiency of pattern book distribution, or the application of inherited templates, the buildings preserve knowledge in their dimensions and orientations, making them archives of information about how their creators understood space, proportion, and humanity's relationship to cosmic order. These symbolic structures survive where other evidence has been obscured. They stand in cities worldwide, encoding mathematical and astronomical knowledge in forms that persist regardless of political changes or historical reinterpretations. Yet today, these same structures and the questions they raise are being examined anew through technologies that did not exist when orthodox historical narratives were established. Digital archives, independent researchers, and new methods of analysis are revealing patterns that institutional scholarship has not systematically investigated, resurrecting questions about Tartari and the 19th century through processes that themselves illuminate how historical knowledge is constructed and controlled. In 2015, a photograph appeared on social media, a sepia image of San Francisco after the 1906 earthquake and fire. The destroyed buildings revealed their internal structures, elaborate basements and subterranean levels extending below what should have been street level. A commenter noticed that the foundations seemed inconsistent with the rapid construction timelines attributed to these structures in official histories. The observation was shared, analyzed, and compared with photographs from other cities. Within months, thousands of people were examining 19th century photographs with new eyes, documenting architectural patterns, buried first floors, and construction anomalies that academic historians had not systematically investigated. The digital age had resurrected Tartary, not through institutional archaeology or sanctioned scholarship, but through crowdsourced investigation and democratized access to historical archives. The hypothesis spread through online communities in ways that illuminate how information moves in networked environments. Early discussions appeared on forums dedicated to alternative history and conspiracy theories, spaces often dismissed by mainstream academia. Yet these communities performed a service that traditional scholarship had neglected. They compiled evidence systematically. They created databases of 19th century photographs, cataloging buried first floors across dozens of cities. They measured architectural proportions from images, documenting the mathematical consistency discussed earlier. They mapped world's fair locations and timelines, noting patterns in construction and demolition. Whatever one makes of their interpretations, the evidence gathering represented serious archival work accessible to anyone with internet connection and willingness to examine primary sources. The role of digitized archives cannot be overstated. Before widespread digitization, access to 19th century photographs, maps, and documents required physical presence in libraries, archives, and museums. Researchers needed institutional affiliation, funding for travel, and time to conduct systematic surveys of materials scattered across repositories. The digitization projects undertaken by libraries, historical societies, and government agencies through the 1990s and 2000s changed this fundamentally. Millions of historical images, maps, and documents became searchable and viewable from anywhere. A person in Australia could examine San Francisco building permits from 1895. Someone in Moscow could compare Chicago World's Fair photographs with St. Petersburg architectural plans. The barriers to primary source access collapsed, distributing historical investigation beyond academic gatekeepers. This democratization revealed something important about knowledge construction. Historical narratives are not simply discovered, but constructed through selection and interpretation of evidence. Academic historians work within frameworks established by their training, their institutional context, and their professional incentives. Questions that fall outside established paradigms or that challenge foundational narratives face higher burdens of proof and greater professional risk. Independent researchers, lacking institutional constraints but also lacking systematic training, can pursue questions that academia avoids, though at the cost of methodological rigor and peer review quality control. The Tartary phenomenon emerged in this gap, driven by pattern recognition that fell outside orthodox historical investigation. Legitimate discoveries have emerged from this independent research. The architectural consistency across 19th century civic buildings, documented through measurements taken from photographs, represents genuine pattern recognition that merits systematic analysis. The timing of buried first floors across multiple cities, correlated with geological and climatological data from the period, identifies a phenomenon requiring explanation beyond what standard urban development narratives provide fully. The demographic anomalies, the orphan train phenomenon contextualized within broader population disruptions, and the erasure of Tartary from cartographic and encyclopedic practice all represent patterns visible in primary sources but underexplored in mainstream historical scholarship. That these patterns came to wider attention through online communities rather than academic journals indicates gaps in institutional research priorities. Yet independent research without methodological discipline produces problems alongside insights. Confirmation bias, the tendency to interpret ambiguous evidence as supporting pre-existing beliefs, affects all human inquiry, but operates with less correction in spaces lacking peer review and institutional accountability. Speculative leaps that might be challenged in academic contexts circulate as established facts in online discussions. Photographic analysis without training in architectural history or photographic interpretation produces confident claims based on misunderstood evidence. The signal-to-noise ratio in online Tartary discussions is low, requiring substantial effort to separate legitimate observations from unfounded speculation. The institutional response has been largely silence. Major history departments and archaeological institutions have not engaged systematically with the questions raised by Tartary researchers. This silence itself invites interpretation. Does it reflect justified dismissal of fringe speculation unworthy of serious attention? Or does it represent defensive reaction to challenges that threaten established narratives? The answer likely varies across institutions and individuals, but the lack of engagement leaves legitimate questions unaddressed by the communities best equipped to investigate them rigorously. A measured institutional response that acknowledged genuine anomalies while subjecting claims to rigorous analysis would serve historical understanding better than dismissal or silence. What can be concluded about Tartary based on available evidence requires acknowledging uncertainty. The maps that labeled vast territories as Tartary for 3 centuries documented something. Whether unified civilization, cultural sphere, or geographic designation encompassing diverse peoples. The travelers who described sophisticated cities and technologies across those territories preserved observations that align with archaeological evidence from the limited excavations conducted. The architectural patterns appearing globally in the late 19th century encode knowledge whose sources and transmission mechanisms remain incompletely understood. The demographic disruptions, geological evidence, and climatological stress of the same period created conditions for transformation on scales that standard histories may understate. Whether these phenomena connect to a lost Tartarian civilization, represent independent patterns coincidentally aligned, or reflect processes conventional history explains adequately, but without examining their cumulative significance, remains genuinely uncertain. The story of Tartary, whether it represents misunderstood geography, forgotten civilization, or pattern of anomalies pointing toward historical complexities not yet integrated into orthodox narratives, teaches that history is not fixed. It is constantly rewritten, not only by new discoveries, but by new questions. The maps showing Tartary exist in digital archives accessible to anyone who looks. The buildings exhibiting architectural sophistication still stand, their proportions and patterns available for measurement. The demographic and geological anomalies of the 19th century remain in records, unexplained by frameworks that may be inadequate rather than incorrect. Whether future archaeology, historiography, or interdisciplinary investigation will vindicate, refute, or complicate the Tartary hypothesis remains uncertain. The value lies in the questioning itself, in the examination of how we know what we know, in the recognition that the past is never as settled as we believe. If you followed this investigation to its conclusion, you have done what all serious inquiry requires: questioned assumptions, examined evidence, and considered alternatives. The maps remember what we have forgotten, and perhaps in that remembering, we discover not only what was lost, but how we came to lose it. If this investigation raised questions for you, share your thoughts in the comments below. Tell us what evidence you find most compelling, what explanations make sense, and where you are watching from tonight. And if you want to explore more histories hidden in plain sight, subscribe to see what other stories wait in the archives we inherited. Today, the territories once marked as Tartary are experiencing transformation again. As glaciers retreat across Siberia and Central Asia, the permafrost that has sealed landscapes for centuries is releasing what it preserved. In 2019, researchers in the Sakha Republic discovered wooden structures emerging from thawing ground, buildings whose construction techniques and materials suggested sophistication, inconsistent with assumptions about the region's recent past. Similar discoveries appear annually now as climate change accelerates the exposure of what ice and frozen Earth have hidden. These are not archaeological excavations undertaken deliberately, but accidental revelations, the planet itself opening archives that human institutions have not systematically explored. Satellite imaging and ground-penetrating radar reveal patterns beneath the surface across former Tartary territories. Geometric formations, linear features suggesting roads or boundaries, and circular structures that may represent foundations or settlement patterns appear in datasets analyzed by geologists studying permafrost dynamics rather than archaeologists investigating human history. The features exist in the data, documented and mapped, but their interpretation remains contested. To some, they represent natural geological formations, periglacial features created by freeze-thaw cycles. To others, they suggest organized human activity on scales that would require revision of conventional understanding about the region's population and development before the modern era. The irony compounds as modern geopolitics reshapes the same territories again. Infrastructure development across Central Asia, driven by Chinese Belt and Road initiatives and Russian development projects, proceeds with limited archaeological survey. Roads, railways, and pipelines cut across landscapes where systematic investigation has never occurred. What might have been preserved for future study disappears under concrete and steel, erased by the same forces of modernization that erased Tartary from earlier maps. The cycle repeats: transformation without documentation, development without investigation, progress that forgets to ask what it destroys. What the Tartary hypothesis represents may matter less than what it reveals about how historical narratives are constructed and maintained. The maps existed. The travelers' accounts survived. The architectural patterns appear measurably. The demographic disruptions are documented. The geological and climatological stress of the 19th century is established through multiple independent proxies. Yet these elements have not been synthesized into orthodox historical narratives, existing instead as isolated facts in specialized subdisciplines that rarely communicate across boundaries. The fragmentation of knowledge mirrors the fragmentation of the territories themselves, divided into specializations that prevent comprehensive understanding. The question shifts from whether Tartary existed as a unified civilization to why the question itself seems radical. A geographic designation used consistently for 3 centuries should not vanish so completely that its reappearance in contemporary discussion marks one as fringe or conspiratorial. The evidence for sophisticated urban centers across Central Asia during medieval and early modern periods exists in archaeological reports, historical texts, and material culture preserved in museums. Yet this evidence has not substantially altered popular or even academic consciousness about the region, which remains characterized as backward until Russian or Soviet modernization brought progress. The persistence of this narrative, despite contradictory evidence, suggests that some stories serve purposes beyond historical accuracy. Perhaps Tartary represents not a single suppressed truth, but a question about historical epistemology itself. How do we know what we know about the past? Through what filters does evidence pass before becoming accepted knowledge? What role do political convenience, institutional inertia, and professional incentives play in determining which questions get investigated and which remain unexplored. The Tartary phenomenon, whatever its basis in historical reality, illuminates these processes by existing at their margins, too visible to ignore entirely, but too inconvenient to address systematically. The buildings still stand, encoding knowledge in proportion and pattern. The maps remain in archives, documenting a world that official histories struggle to explain. The demographic records preserve disruptions whose causes remain inadequately explored. The geological strata contain evidence of a more dynamic 19th century than standard narratives acknowledge. The technologies embedded in structures supposedly built rapidly demonstrate sophistication requiring explanation. All of this exists not as speculation, but as documented fact, accessible to anyone willing to examine primary sources without presuming that conventional explanations are necessarily complete. What happens next depends partly on whether institutions choose engagement or continued silence. The questions raised by Tartary researchers, however imperfectly formulated, point toward genuine anomalies in the historical record. Systematic investigation by scholars with methodological training and institutional resources could address these anomalies rigorously, either confirming conventional explanations through thorough analysis or revealing complexities that require narrative revision. The alternative is continued fragmentation, with independent researchers pursuing questions in methodologically inconsistent ways while academic institutions maintain orthodox narratives without addressing challenges comprehensively. The story of Tartary, then, is a story about memory and forgetting, about how civilizations can vanish from collective consciousness within generations, about how maps and buildings preserve what written histories erase. It is a reminder that the past remains less certain than we pretend, that the 19th century in particular may have been more transformative and traumatic than its reputation as a period of steady progress suggests. The ice is melting. The archives are digital. The questions are being asked. What they reveal will depend on whether we have courage to look at evidence without presuming we already know what it means, to question narratives without abandoning rigor, and to remember that history serves the present but should not be enslaved by it. The maps that once drew Tartary across a third of the world were not fantasies, but attempts at understanding. Perhaps it is time to attempt that understanding again, with better tools but similar humility about how much remains unknown. Today, the territories once marked as Tartary are experiencing transformation again. As glaciers retreat across Siberia and Central Asia, the permafrost that has sealed landscapes for centuries is releasing what it preserved. In 2019, researchers in the Sakha Republic discovered wooden structures emerging from thawing ground, buildings whose construction techniques and materials suggested sophistication inconsistent with assumptions about the region's recent past. Similar discoveries appear annually now as climate change accelerates the exposure of what ice and frozen earth have hidden. These are not archaeological excavations undertaken deliberately, but accidental revelations, the planet itself opening archives that human institutions have not systematically explored. Satellite imaging and ground-penetrating radar reveal patterns beneath the surface across former Tartary territories. Geometric formations, linear features suggesting roads or boundaries, and circular structures that may represent foundations or settlement patterns appear in datasets analyzed by geologists studying permafrost dynamics rather than archaeologists investigating human history. The features exist in the data, documented and mapped, but their interpretation remains contested. To some, they represent natural geological formations, periglacial features created by freeze-thaw cycles. To others, they suggest organized human activity on scales that would require revision of conventional understanding about the region's population and development before the modern era. The irony compounds as modern geopolitics reshapes the same territories again. Infrastructure development across Central Asia, driven by Chinese Belt and Road initiatives and Russian development projects, proceeds with limited archaeological survey. Roads, railways, and pipelines cut across landscapes where systematic investigation has never occurred. What might have been preserved for future study disappears under concrete and steel, erased by the same forces of modernization that erased Tartary from earlier maps. The cycle repeats: transformation without documentation, development without investigation, progress that forgets to ask what it destroys. What the Tartary hypothesis represents may matter less than what it reveals about how historical narratives are constructed and maintained. The maps existed, the travelers' accounts survived, the architectural patterns appear measurably, the demographic disruptions are documented. The geological and climatological stress of the 19th century is established through multiple independent proxies. Yet these elements have not been synthesized into orthodox historical narratives, existing instead as isolated facts in specialized subdisciplines that rarely communicate across boundaries. The fragmentation of knowledge mirrors the fragmentation of the territories themselves, divided into specializations that prevent comprehensive understanding. The question shifts from whether Tartary existed as a unified civilization to why the question itself seems radical. A geographic designation used consistently for 3 centuries should not vanish so completely that its reappearance in contemporary discussion marks one as fringe or conspiratorial. The evidence for sophisticated urban centers across Central Asia during medieval and early modern periods exists in archaeological reports, historical texts, and material culture preserved in museums. Yet this evidence has not substantially altered popular or even academic consciousness about the region, which remains characterized as backward until Russian or Soviet modernization brought progress. The persistence of this narrative, despite contradictory evidence, suggests that some stories serve purposes beyond historical accuracy. Perhaps Tartary represents not a single suppressed truth, but a question about historical epistemology itself. How do we know what we know about the past? Through what filters does evidence pass before becoming accepted knowledge? What role do political convenience, institutional inertia, and professional incentives play in determining which questions get investigated and which remain unexplored? The Tartary phenomenon, whatever its basis in historical reality, illuminates these processes by existing at their margins, too visible to ignore entirely, but too inconvenient to address systematically. The buildings still stand, encoding knowledge in proportion and pattern. The maps remain in archives, documenting a world that official histories struggle to explain. The demographic records preserve disruptions whose causes remain inadequately explored. The geological strata contain evidence of a more dynamic 19th century than standard narratives acknowledge. The technologies embedded in structures supposedly built rapidly demonstrate sophistication requiring explanation. All of this exists not as speculation, but as documented fact, accessible to anyone willing to examine primary sources without presuming that conventional explanations are necessarily complete. What happens next depends partly on whether institutions choose engagement or continued silence. The questions raised by Tartary researchers, however imperfectly formulated, point toward genuine anomalies in the historical record. Systematic investigation by scholars with methodological training and institutional resources could address these anomalies rigorously, either confirming conventional explanations through thorough analysis or revealing complexities that require narrative revision. The alternative is continued fragmentation, with independent researchers pursuing questions in methodologically inconsistent ways, while academic institutions maintain orthodox narratives without addressing challenges comprehensively. The story of Tartary, then, is a story about memory and forgetting, about how civilizations can vanish from collective consciousness within generations, about how maps and buildings preserve what written histories erase. It is a reminder that the past remains less certain than we pretend, that the 19th century, in particular, may have been more transformative and traumatic than its reputation as a period of steady progress suggests. The ice is melting. The archives are digital. The questions are being asked. What they reveal will depend on whether we have courage to look at evidence without presuming we already know what it means, to question narratives without abandoning rigor, and to remember that history serves the present, but should not be enslaved by it. The maps that once drew Tartary across a third of the world were not fantasies, but attempts at understanding. Perhaps it is time to attempt that understanding again, with better tools, but similar humility about how much remains unknown.